How much do our motives matter to God? A lot more than we might think. That's what we're talking about today, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Coloring Through the Bible. My name is Keanne Harkins, and today we're talking about our motives. The end result of what we do doesn't matter anywhere close to the motivation behind why we do it. And this is why you can do a good thing with the wrong motives and still not see God's blessings in your life. And also why you can do the wrong thing with the right motives and God will bless you for it. Now, that doesn't mean that we can just go off and start sinning and doing all kinds of bad things, because then our motives would be that we want to do what we want to do. Our motives wouldn't be glorifying God. See, that's the thing. What our heart is what is important to God. And we can't see that any better than in the life of David. And he's constantly described as the man after God's own heart. His heart loved the Lord, but he was human. And his humanity and his tendency to mess up is what makes David a character that we can identify with, because we all mess up. But the difference is, sometimes David messed up because he had the right motives but didn't know how to handle them well. And sometimes David messed up because his motives were selfish and he wasn't giving God glory. He was giving himself glory. And in those instances, God always disciplined him because he loves him. He loved him so much, he wanted him to be the best version of himself. So we're going to be kind of looking at why our motives are so important. We're going to look at two incidences from David's life. And we're going to see where he did something that wasn't bad, something that was a good thing with the wrong motives, and God disciplined him for it. And then we're going to look at a time where he wanted to do something that wasn't good because God hadn't told him to do it, but his motives were to give God glory, and so God blessed him. So the first instance comes to us out of 1 Chronicles. Actually, they both come to us out of 1 Chronicles. We hear that David decided he wanted to know how many men he had in his army that he could call up to fight for Israel. So he calls his army commander and he says, "Count all the able-bodied men and tell me how many men I have in my army." And we understand, we get our first clue that his motives weren't good by the response of the commander of his army. Now, this guy had been with him since the beginning. He knew David probably better than anybody else. And his response to this was, why? Why are you doing this? Don't you trust that God is going to provide everything that we need? 1 Chronicles 21 starts off in verse 1 saying that Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel. Right there we know that this desire to take a census didn't come from God. Now, taking a census isn't a bad thing. It's counting people. It's not a sin. In fact, God had commanded Moses to take a census of the people twice. So the census part of it isn't the sin. It's the motivation. Now, Satan tempted. He whispered in David's ear. He tempts us. He whispers in our ear. And sometimes it's easier to be fooled, to be tricked, to stumble in that temptation when the actual end result isn't a sin. But our motivation behind it is. And we see that with David. Taking the census wasn't a bad thing, but his motivation wasn't to give God glory. It was to give himself glory. In fact, the best definition I have of why this was such a bad thing actually is in the footnotes of my Bible. So I wanted to share with you what it said. It says, "It's evident that his action was motivated either by pride in the size of his empire that he had acquired, or by reliance for his security on the size of the reserve of manpower he could muster. The mere taking of a census was hardly sinful, but in this instance it represented an unwarranted glory in and dependence on human power rather than on the Lord." So he did something not sinful with the wrong motives, and God judged the motives, not the action. In fact, we read in 1 Chronicles 21, starting in verse 11, God had told David's personal priest, Gad, to deliver a message to David. So Gad went to David and said to him, "This is what the Lord says. Take your choice. 3 years of famine, 3 months of being swept away before your enemies with their swords overtaking you, or 3 days of the sword of the Lord, days of plague in the land, with the angel of the Lord ravaging every part of Israel. Now then, decide how I should answer the one who sent me." God punished his motives, not his actions. His actions weren't sinful, but his motives were. And incidentally, David chose the 3 days of the Lord, and 70,000 men died by the plague in those 3 days. That was the discipline that God meted out on Israel because of David's sinful motivation to an unsinful event. That's how important our motivation is. Now, the next thing that we're going to look at is when David wanted to do something that wasn't good, but his motives were good, and so God blessed him. That comes to us also out of 1 Chronicles, just a few chapters before. In 1 Chronicles chapter 17, we read, "After David was settled in his palace, he said to Nathan the prophet, 'Here I am living in the palace of cedar, while the ark of the covenant of the Lord is under a tent.' Nathan replied to David, 'Whatever you have in mind, do it, for God is with you.'" So he's encouraging him. But then, that night, God talks to Nathan. And I love his answer to him. I love how God has this sense of humor and this kind of a little bit of a snarky side to him sometimes. So in verse 4, God tells Nathan, "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. You are not the one to build me a house to dwell in. I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought Israel out of Egypt to this day. I have moved from one tent site to another, from one dwelling place to another. Wherever I have moved with all of Israelites, did I ever say to any of their leaders whom I commanded to shepherd my people, 'Why have you not built me a house of cedar?'" I love that kind of snarkiness. He's like, seriously, did I ever tell anybody that I needed a wood house to live in? God had commanded them to make that tent. He had given them the instructions. He had sent the skilled people to do it. He'd been very specific about how this tent that housed the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to be. He never told David or anybody that he needed a wood house. So David was doing something God never told him to do that wasn't God's plan. But his motives were pure. His motives were a love of the Lord, a desire to put God first, to give the best to God. And so even though his actions weren't right, his motives were right, and God blessed him. He blessed him immensely because his heart was devoted to God. And as we read down a little bit further in that 1 Chronicles chapter 17, we read the blessings that God poured out because his motives were so amazing. We read in verse 8 of 1 Chronicles 17, "I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name like the names of the greatest men of the earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I also will subdue all your enemies." God blessed David, and not just David. He blessed Israel for the sake of David. So you see, the first instance, because David was the king, and the more authority you have, the greater the consequences of your decisions. And so when the king messed up, all of Israel paid the price. And when the king did good, all of Israel reaped the reward. But the important thing that we get from these two examples is that God blessed the motivation and he disciplined the motivation. We're all going to fall sometimes. We're not always going to succeed in everything that we try. Our motives matter to the Lord. So whatever you do, don't worry so much about the execution of it. That will come. Worry about why you're doing what you're doing. Are you donating your time to charities? Are you doing it because you believe in being humble? Because you want to serve God's people? Because you see a need and you have a way of filling it? Then great. Expect God's blessings in your life, because God is going to bless you because your heart is in the right place. Are you doing the exact same thing, but your motivation is that you want people to know that you are working in a charity? Do you want to be seen? Do you want the world to think that you're a good person? Are you counting it off on your taxes? Is that why you're donating? Whatever your motivation is, that's what determines whether or not you see the blessings or the discipline of God. So let's focus on why we do what we do, because that's all that matters. I hope you guys have been encouraged to do good things from a good heart, a heart that loves the Lord and puts Him first. Until we see each other again, have a truly blessed day.